of Ektron you're on, the more opportunity there is to leverage the current better APIs for getting content from Ektron and then being able to push them into Epi. The older versions of Ektron, there are some pre-built solutions and custom and pre-built code out there that help do that, but the newer version that you're on, probably the better. Also, at the time that you're thinking about doing this migration, whether it's you're also planning to do a redesign or re-architecting of the site, either visually or from an information architecture navigation perspective, or whether you're just re-platforming. Each of those have different criteria and different expectations as you move from one to the other. And if you are planning to do a redesign and re-architecture, then the things that you have to do in terms of content migration and code migration are just pretty common no matter what platform. And if you're just doing re-platforming, you still have to do the elements that we're talking about in terms of content migration and code migration. You also need to think about if there are any kind of new functionality that you want to take advantage of. And, most of our customers who are using Ektron, they're not using all the possible features of Ektron. So as you think about moving to and planning for migrating to Episerver, you want to look at the functional capabilities of Episerver. And even if you just want to do the re-platforming as opposed to any kind of redesign or re-architecture, it's worthwhile taking a look at some of the new features, because things like, and we'll show a little bit of that today, things like targeting and personalization are just so easy to implement within Episerver. You might as well take a look at that and plan for that even with a re-platforming model. And then if you have a variety of search options in the Ektron pantheon, you could be using, if you're on an older version, Microsoft Index Search, you could be using Microsoft Search Server, you could be using Epi, you could be using a third party. So lots of choices in search, and you'll have to think about and plan for those choices as you move to Episerver. Many of them could be the same. I mean, you can use Solar, for example, on both platforms, or third-party searches on both platforms, for example. James, you have any other sort of high-level stuff you'd want to add to that?
Oh, I think you covered it very well. Some of those search choices are actually available to the Ektron customer base as well. So if you're not ready to make the full move, you can start implementing some of the new technology. And we'll talk about search, and commerce is also available for the Ektron customer base if they want to take advantage of a real commerce platform. Whereas Ektron's was more a module, then we can take a lot of these tools that are somewhat separate from the Episerver CMS side of things and make those available to the Ektron customers as well. So there are a lot of different ways that we can work with you.
Okay. So of those 4 buckets that I spoke about earlier, let's talk about content migration, because that's a pretty big component to migrating from the Ektron experience to the Episerver experience. And clearly the first kind of thing that you really want to start planning for is doing a content audit. Because the size of your content repository does matter. I mean, it does matter whether you have 1,000 content objects to move versus 10,000 or 100,000. And so that's an important step to take, and content auditing helps you to really get a hold of that. I think it's also an opportunity, when you think about the size of your current repository, to look at what might be considered, rot, redundant, outdated, or trivial content. And as you do your content audit, think about how you can reduce the overall effort of content migration by reducing the number of content objects based on good analysis of whether they're even useful anymore. Certainly, something to think about is also the types of content that you have. Again, if you have a majority of binary files like PDFs and Word docs, Excel docs, others, then there is a certain amount of activity that goes into transferring those binary documents. And that's probably not as tough of a migration process as HTML content. And then other types of content, whether that content is embedded in things like smart forms or in page builders pages, those add complexity and planning to the process. It's also very important to think about content metadata. And we do see over time with Ektron customers who've had Ektron for a while, their metadata library tends to have been gotten a bit bloated, maybe a little bit out of control. Now's your opportunity to get that back into, under control as you do a migration process. But the good thing about metadata is it's a structured environment in Ektron, and it's a structured environment in Episerver. So structured components are easier to do than sort of unstructured components. Another thing to think about is certainly your content taxonomy, and how not only the breadth and depth of your taxonomy and how it's how you've tagged your content and other objects with the taxonomy, but also how you use that taxonomy, whether it's being used for things like to drive menus or whether it's used to drive other types of navigational experiences, will impact how you plan for the move to Episerver. Episerver does have a taxonomy structure called categories, but there are also other ways to accomplish what sometimes you used in Ektron, you use taxonomy for in Ektron, you might accomplish slightly different ways in Episerver. It has a more flexible approach to navigation as well as other capabilities. Again, I think you really should take a look at things like orphan content or orphan pages. Certainly many customers who've been using Ektron for a while have more templates that have been built over time, and many of them may not be used anymore. You might have smart forms that have gone dormant. So as part of your content audit, think about those various structures, the types of pages you have, the orphan content, and make sure that you plan for what you do with those. Sometimes you can just ignore them as part of the migration process, but sometimes you might want to potentially archive them as part of that migration process. So all of these things will help you determine some of the, how much you put into your migration planning and the division between trying to automate it versus trying to manually move content. And if you have fewer complexities, the more likely a manual, and fewer, a smaller repository, more likely a manual migration. It could be within realm of reasonable possibility. And then the more complex, the more you want to probably think about doing some automated scripting. And James, the volume, velocity, and value proposition is kind of your term. I don't know if you want to say a few more words about that.
Yeah, it's sort of a different way of saying at least some of what you've already said. So volume is just the sheer quantity of content that you have. And that, of course, does play into your migration strategy and how you want to approach that. But something to keep in mind is that any of these different variables could change for different types of content. So your home page as a type of content, your volume on that is going to be very, very low. Whereas press releases, you may have just a hugely high volume of content that needs to be transferred over. Velocity is also a factor in whether you want to try to manually move something or get it scripted over. Something that has a high velocity has a high churn rate to its content. So something like a news website that has publications going out, many, many times per day is a high velocity website. A low velocity website would just be more or less an informational website. May still be very valuable, and that doesn't change that fact, but there's just not a lot of content updates going into the site. And so that affects how much of a content freeze you can actually withstand. So for some organizations saying, hey, we're going to freeze your content for a couple of days, they'll say no big deal. Other organizations, that's a business no-no. They just can't handle that. And then the value of the content. When I think about value of content, I actually think about some of our pharmaceutical customers where their drug content is actually very, very highly regulated. And the value of that content is very high to their business and has to be moved over with just precision accuracy. And so that also lends to the need for a machine or scripted migration effort to make sure that the consistency and the quality of the transfer is there throughout.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the page complexity items, smart forms and page builders on the next in terms of code migration, but they also have content migration characteristics to them too. And so smart forms, actually, if you're using smart forms a lot, then the code migration, the scripted ability for code migration is probably a little bit more feasible. You know, smart forms are structured content in Ektron, and Episerver also has a structured page type model that allows you to sort of simulate or you know, have a similar kind of approach to capturing content, and that's because they're both structured, you can write scripts that map one to the other in an automated way. Page Builder, you know, Page Builder is a rendering layout model, and it's done slightly differently and frankly much more easily, smoothly in Episerver. And so there are going to be issues if you've built a lot of Page Builder pages as your content, and you know, you have to plan for sort of chunking out the various elements of your Page Builder pages and mapping those to where they might sit within a new sort of content and object block methodology that is executed by Episerver. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about code migration too. So after content migration, definitely have to think about code migration. And again, you know, these are two different platforms, Ektron and Episerver. And one of the key new factors about Episerver is that it is built for MVC. You can do both web forms and MVC on Episerver, but moving forward, Epi is recommending the MVC framework as the most modern and effective framework for Episerver implementations. So, you know, there's lots of arguments back and forth about the, you know, MVC versus web forms, but we are seeing sort of this migration to MVC in a lot of the applications in our space, not just the CMS applications. If you are planning to just re-platform, you do have to think about whether you're going to take all this experience that you have in web forms-based .NET development and how that can be modified and migrated to an MVC environment. I think another also, you know, important thing to think about is as you do code migration, the difference between front-end code, you know, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and the back-end code, C# or VB that you were, you know, currently using. And it's actually, you know, the front-end code, if built well, you know, there are opportunities to leverage your existing front-end code that's used to present information on your Ektron sites and leverage that reasonably well in Episerver. However, if, you know, you have a front-end code that has been developed over time and ad hoc, you know, you really are going to have to think about how you re-architect that front-end code as you move to Episerver. Back-end code, it is a re-architecture. You know, Episerver uses different APIs. You could choose to move from the web forms framework to .NET, to MVC. So there's significant, you know, planning and migration issues of the back-end code related to that migration. And again, there are code issues with the use of page builder forms as well as smart forms and how Episerver manages page layout architecture and manages structured metadata architecture. So you kind of build the back-end code differently in Episerver in order to manage dynamic page layouts and manage the metadata and structured content of page types in Episerver. Another sort of factor is if you're, you know, on an older version of Ektron and you use a lot of XSLT and the classic Ektron server controls, you're definitely going to have to sort of rethink that model. XSLT as a presentation layer, kind of not used as much anymore, and you're going to be using more, hopefully more modern HTML, CSS approaches to the presentation layer. Sort of the classic Ektron server controls, can relatively easily, those widgets that you might use on page builder pages can be relatively easily rebuilt, repurposed, reimagined using the Episerver block model in Episerver. And again, if you're on a responsive framework already, you have kind of a leg up in this migration process because your front-end responsive framework code could transfer fairly well into a new Episerver if you're just doing replatforming. Again, if you're doing redesign and re-architecture, then you're going to be rebuilding that front end anyway. If you're not on a responsive framework, you probably are going to want to take this opportunity as you migrate to move into a responsive framework, even if all you want to do is replatform. Even if you want to keep your current design and your current information architecture, now is a really good time to think about rebuilding that front end in a responsive framework. So, and then, just like with content migration, doing a code audit is probably an important step that you can start taking now, even before you dive into, or even prior to making the final decision about migration. Understanding how many ASPX templates, how many ASCX controls you have, how many various components you've built, the pages and page types that have been built, how many smart forms, how many page builders. Do a solid audit of those elements, and that'll allow you to manage and plan for the code migration. And obviously a big issue for most of our customers, certainly in this space, is integration to other applications. Most of the folks in this environment, in member-based organizations, have critical integrations to things like their back-end association management system, their AMS, or a CRM that's used as an AMS, or to their LMS system, their advocacy systems. There's a wide variety of technology systems that are used, and integration to those are an important factor in the code migration planning for moving to Episerver from Ektron.